I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. Mark Twain.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here, and today we turn our attention abroad to follow the United States as it becomes an imperial power. Thanks to the rapid economic expansion of the Gilded Age, the United States became a global economic force in the 19th century. As the 1800s came to a close, many in the United States wanted to exercise and extend that power abroad. This practice is known as imperialism. Today, we'll catalog the early efforts at forging an American empire. But first, we need to ask a big question. Should the United States endeavor to spread democracy? We know by now that Americans have long cherished their identity as leaders in democracy. And that identity has guided American policy throughout its history. Jeffersonians during the 1790s felt that Americans had a special obligation to assist France during its democratic revolution. In the 1820s, James Monroe asserted the United States' responsibility to protect the fledgling republics of Latin America. And during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln refused to negotiate with the Confederacy because he felt that the failure of American democracy would doom democracy worldwide. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the United States took a much more active role in protecting and spreading democracy beyond its continental borders. These efforts brought international notoriety to the United States, but also international scrutiny. What some have called a moral imperative, others have dubbed imperial aggression. And we still face these debates today. Recent wars in Asia and the Middle East have been driven by, among other things, the desire to spread democracy. But we've seen these efforts take unexpected and unwelcome turns in the last 20 years. So, should the United States continue the noble mission of liberating the oppressed around the world? Or are our efforts better dedicated to fortifying democracy at home? To help us decide, let's go back to where this imperial ambition began. Our first big idea outlines the major causes for American imperialism in the late 1800s. Near the turn of the 20th century, American expansionism was driven by industrial, strategic, and racial factors. To be clear, the United States was not the only nation looking to expand its empire in the late 19th century. European countries were also heavily involved in empire building. You may remember learning about the Scramble for Africa or the Raj in India in your world or European history class. And as it turns out, the imperial motivations for Americans mirrored the Europeans. First and foremost, there was an economic incentive to expand. The industrial age of the late 1800s witnessed the rise of factories and mass production. By the end of the century, America was producing more than ever before, but production was outpacing population growth. The need for new markets and new buyers, as well as the rising demand for more natural resources, drove many industrialists to support expansionist activities near the end of the 1800s. There was also a strategic military motivation at work. In 1890, American expansionist and historian Alfred T. Mahan published a monograph called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. In this book, Mahan argued that the most powerful nations in history all had one thing in common. They controlled the seas. To the extent that the United States wanted to become such a power, Mahan made a number of recommendations. First, he said that the United States needed to update its navy, outfitting it with steam-powered steel warships to replace the wooden sailboats of old. Second, Mahan pointed out that the new Navy would require coaling stations throughout the world so that it could carry out its missions without running out of fuel. And third, he stressed the importance of building a canal in Central America, one that would allow the American fleet to move from one coast to the other. Together, these recommendations provided the blueprint for imperial expansion, and all of them were eventually carried out by imperialist American leaders. In addition to the economic and strategic causes of imperialism, a number of social factors played a role as well. Foremost among them was race and racism. White supremacy highlighted the age of imperialism. Racism, of course, was not new in the United States, but it took on a new face in the 1890s and beyond. Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and evolution was twisted in order to justify the conquest of weaker nations by stronger ones. This side of social Darwinism is perhaps best captured by the English poet Rudyard Kipling, whose 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden, suggested that non-white populations were less civilized and less evolved, and required the assistance and care of the white race. He wrote, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." Kipling's word choice reveals the racist inclinations of the white man's burden. Referring to non-white people as half devil and half child is intended to suggest that they are less human and less developed than whites, and that they actually benefit from white conquest. Incidentally, these sentiments echoed the arguments of white slaveholders in the antebellum South, and they were frequently repeated in imperialist circles. In the United States, the argument was echoed by the Reverend Josiah Strong, who insisted that the white race had a moral obligation to intervene around the world in order to save what he believed were the helpless members of non-white and non-Christian societies. As we look more at specific examples of American involvement in imperial activities, make note of how this brand of racism was used to justify political and economic domination of other countries. Our second big idea introduces some of these examples. Prior to 1900, the United States built a Pacific empire that included Alaska, Hawaii, and the Philippines. American interest in the Pacific had actually begun prior to the Civil War, but it wasn't until after the war concluded that the United States made waves in that part of the world. Secretary of State William Seward negotiated for the purchase of Alaska from the Russians in 1867, giving the United States a foothold in the North Pacific. Seward also achieved the annexation of the Midway Islands in the same year. The United States also took a keen interest in Hawaii in the 1800s. Americans established a missionary presence there in the 1820s, and an economic relationship followed near the middle of the century. By the late 1800s, powerful American businessmen in Hawaii sensed that the Hawaiian kingdom was vulnerable, so they, with help from the U.S. government, orchestrated an overthrow of the Hawaiian monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. They then called for the United States to annex the islands, which it did in 1898. Further west, the United States also wrestled the Philippine Islands from Spain in 1899, but more on this in a moment. By the end of the 19th century, we can see that the United States had procured a number of Pacific territories that stretched towards Asia. In addition to the economic benefits that these territories provided to the U.S., they also served as coaling stations for a navy that was growing increasingly reliant on steam-powered vessels. One other thing we should note about America's Pacific Empire, the United States governed its Pacific holdings directly by making them official U.S. territories. As you know, Alaska and Hawaii eventually became U.S. states as well. But the United States had its eye on Latin America too. U.S. activity in the Caribbean is outlined in our third big idea. The 1898 Spanish-American War, which traced economic and political causes, expelled Spain from the Western Hemisphere, gave the United States a controlling interest in Cuba and other Caribbean nations, and awarded control of the Philippines to the United States. The Spanish Empire, which had once claimed nearly all of Latin America, shrunk dramatically in the 1800s. By 1890, Spain had lost all of its imperial holdings, with a few exceptions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In 1895, Cubans launched a rebellion in an attempt to win their independence from Spain. It was actually the third such attempt, but this one showed promise. The guerrilla tactics of the Cuban rebels proved difficult to repress, so Spain deployed troops under the command of Valeriano Weyler to squash the rebellion. Weyler employed a strategy of total war against the Cubans. similar to the tactics used by William T. Sherman during the American Civil War. Weyler burned the sugar fields that sustained the rebellions and established concentration camps for Cuban guerrilla fighters and civilians. Meanwhile, the United States looked on with increasing interest. Cuban independence would give the United States better access to the Cuban sugar industry. Many officials in the government and a number of savvy American industrialists favored intervention on behalf of the Cuban rebels. But the United States could not go to war with Spain without public support. Fortunately for American expansionists, the newspaper media was happy to deliver it. During the Gilded Age, a new style of reporting called yellow journalism flourished as a major trend in print media. Yellow journalists wrote sensationalized stories that were often exaggerated and based very loosely in fact, if at all. Major editors like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer learned that this style of reporting sold far more papers than simply delivering the day's news in black and white. Yellow journalists were essentially tabloid writers, and their papers were read nationwide. In the late 1800s, Hearst, Pulitzer, and others appealed to Americans through their papers to support intervening in the Cuban Revolution. After all, if America were to go to war with Spain, it would make for big news, and for the papers, big profit. Check out this excerpt from Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, reporting on the events in Cuba. Blood on the roadsides, blood in the fields, blood on the doorsteps, blood, blood, blood. The old, the young, the weak, the crippled, all are butchered without mercy. Is there no nation wise enough, brave enough, and strong enough to restore peace in this blood-smitten land? Now, to be sure, General Weyler was a bad dude, but we can see here the unmasked intent of yellow journalists to appeal to the raw emotions of their readers, and it worked. Slowly, American support for intervention mounted. The tipping point came in February 1898 when an American warship, the USS Maine, exploded in Cuban waters. Now, scholarship in the 1970s concluded that the ship was destroyed when an accidental fire ignited ammunition stores in the hull. But back in 1898, the Yellow Press quickly accused Spain of perpetrating an attack, one that killed 260 American sailors. President William McKinley's administration came to the same conclusion and implored Congress to declare war on Spain in April in 1898. They did, but with a caveat. To reassure the American people and the Cubans that this would not be a war of conquest, Congress passed the Teller Amendment, which stated that the goal of American involvement in the war was Cuban independence, not annexation. In essence, the Teller Amendment declared that America simply wanted to spread democracy to the Cubans. The Spanish-American War had begun. The United States helped bring a swift end to the Cuban Revolution. The U.S. Navy overmatched Spanish opposition, and American forces won a decisive battle at Havana, Cuba. The United States also attacked Spanish officials in the Philippines and seized that capital at Manila. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in August of 1898, less than 4 months after it began. The terms of the treaty were as follows. In keeping with the Teller Amendment, Cuba received independence from Spain. However, we should note that the word independence is used here loosely. The United States was largely responsible for crafting the new Cuban Constitution, which included a provision known as the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment required Cuba to consult with the United States on a number of matters, thereby creating an unequal relationship between the two countries and giving the U.S. a mechanism for controlling affairs on the island. Cuba was independent, but perhaps in name only. The Treaty of Paris also held that Spain was to cede Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. Both became U.S. territories. And finally, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States in exchange for a cash payment of $20 million. The acquisition of the Philippines was a key strategic victory for the U.S., as it provided a foothold near Asia in the South Pacific. However, things on the islands quickly spun out of control, leading to questions about the larger implications of American imperialism. This is our fourth big idea. The United States governance of the Philippines triggered a rebellion on those islands. American efforts to end that rebellion inspired debates over the morality and merits of American imperialism. The results of the Spanish-American War left the Philippine Islands in American hands. But this was an unwelcome development for many Filipinos, who, despite having rallied with the Americans against the Spanish during the war, had been left out of the peace negotiations at Paris. Filipino revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo had assumed that by helping the Americans to defeat Spain, the U.S. would grant independence to the Philippines, as they had promised to do for the Cubans. But after the war, the Americans turned on Aguinaldo and announced that the U.S. would govern the Philippines directly. Future President William Howard Taft was named Governor of the Philippines, and Taft channeled the white man's burden when he referred to the Filipino people as America's little brown brothers, stating that they would need at least 50 years of American oversight before they would be capable of self-government. Aguinaldo and his followers disagreed, and thus decided that their war was not yet over. They launched a rebellion against U.S. officials on the island. As had the Cubans in their revolution, Aguinaldo's forces relied mainly on guerrilla tactics, which were met with a harsh American response. The United States established concentration camps to contain the guerrilla fighters, and executed rebels and civilians en masse. These were many of the same behaviors that, when perpetrated by the Spanish, had triggered U.S. intervention in Cuba. This time, however, they were committed by U.S. officials and under the American flag. To make matters worse for the Filipinos, in 1901, the Supreme Court determined in a series of decisions known as the Insular Cases that people living in U.S. territories abroad, like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, were not entitled to the rights and protections provided by the Constitution. These rulings legitimized the American tactics in the Philippines and stripped the Filipino people of any legal recourse against the United States. The turning point in the Philippine insurrection came in 1901, when Emilio Aguinaldo was captured and forced to take an oath of loyalty to the United States. Without its leader, the revolutionary movement collapsed, and while resistance did continue for much of the next decade, American control of the islands was secured by 1902. Now, American action in the Philippines sparked outrage among many at home, and debate over the morality of imperialism intensified. The Anti-Imperialist League was organized to oppose the practice, and it claimed prominent membership including author Mark Twain, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and presidential hopeful William Jennings Bryan. The League published their official platform in 1900. In part, it read, "We hold that the policy known as imperialism is hostile to liberty and tends toward militarism, an evil from which it has been our glory to be free. We regret that it has become necessary in the land of Washington and Lincoln to reaffirm that all men of whatever race or color are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We insist that the subjugation of any people is criminal aggression." Anti-imperialists criticized U.S. actions as a perversion of American ideals. They rejected the premise that Americans were the stewards of freedom and democracy abroad, arguing instead that imperialism and colonialism undermined those very values. And when it comes to U.S. action in the Philippines, historians generally agree. Despite these voices, however, imperial attitudes prevailed and endured in American foreign policy for much of the next 2 decades. This is our final big idea. During the 1900s and 1910s, American presidents engaged in a variety of methods to exert influence over foreign nations that included military, economic, and political coercion. So, American imperialism during the late 1800s usually involved direct United States control of foreign territories, exemplified by the annexation of Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and others. But after the significant troubles in the Philippines, U.S. imperial strategy underwent a shift after 1900. The United States continued to expand its influence over foreign nations, but it did so less directly. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson each employed distinct methods to exercise American power abroad. Roosevelt's approach to foreign policy was known as big stick diplomacy, also referred to as gunboat diplomacy. Teddy Roosevelt used military force, or the threat of military force, to achieve international goals and to exert influence over foreign nations. 3 examples explain. In 1903, the United States was pursuing its interest in building a canal through the Isthmus of Panama. However, Panama was then controlled by the nation of Colombia, who refused to permit the U.S. to construct the canal. So Roosevelt ordered U.S. operatives to incite a rebellion of the Panamanian people against Colombia. When they did, Roosevelt deployed the USS Nashville to Panamanian waters and prevented Colombia from reinforcing its troops against the rebellion. Panama won its independence and immediately awarded the United States a canal zone as a not-so-subtle thank you for their help in the revolution. The following year, Roosevelt threatened more military action in Latin America with his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Tensions were rising between Europe and Latin America, particularly Venezuela, which was defaulting on European loans. Britain, Germany, and Italy all threatened to take action against Venezuela, but Roosevelt stepped in. In his 1904 State of the Union, he declared, "Chronic wrongdoing may, in America as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States to the exercise of an international police power." Basically, the Roosevelt corollary asserted that the United States would be the police of the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt declared that the U.S. would not hesitate to intervene if Latin American countries could not play nice with Europe, the United States, or each other. The third example of TR's gunboat diplomacy involves actual gunboats. Roosevelt was a leading proponent of upgrading the U.S. Navy by outfitting them with steel battleships powered by steam. As 1910 approached, this upgrade was nearly complete. Between 1907 and 1909, Roosevelt deployed his Great White Fleet of battleships on a tour of the world. The main purpose of the tour was to demonstrate the military power of the U.S. Navy and warn any nation of the danger of opposing American objectives. Roosevelt's hawkish approach to foreign policy was no doubt effective, but it began to fall out of favor with the American people, especially after the Philippine insurrection. Still, his successors found ways to exert American influence abroad just the same. Elected in 1908, William Howard Taft was known for his economic approach to imperialism, dollar diplomacy. Taft relied on U.S. economic power to exert influence over Latin America. This was particularly effective in Haiti. Taft recognized that debt could be a powerful tool in international diplomacy. Accordingly, he encouraged American banks to invest in Latin America by flooding their economies with cheap loans, all the while keeping European investors away. The strategy allowed the United States to control countries like Haiti by holding their debt over their heads, or using additional loans as incentives in exchange for policy goals. Taft employed a similar strategy in Honduras by purchasing that nation's debt from the British, removing British influence and establishing America's. Taft served a single term in office and was replaced by Woodrow Wilson, who shifted America's strategy towards what he called moral diplomacy. Moral diplomacy relied on influencing foreign nations to conform to American ideals like freedom and democracy. Wilson denied U.S. support to any nation who violated these ideals. Wilson thus believed that it was his duty to use American power to spread democracy around the world, sometimes aggressively. In 1913, Wilson refused to recognize Mexican dictator Victoriano Huerta, who had seized power with military force. Wilson denounced Huerta and employed measures that damaged Mexico's economy. He also ordered the occupation of Veracruz until Huerta surrendered power, which he eventually did. During his presidency, Wilson deployed troops throughout Latin America, including places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in order to oversee elections there. Often, the occupations would continue until the election's outcome was favorable to Wilson and the United States. He once remarked, "I will teach the republics of Latin America to elect good men." While Wilson and Taft took less hostile approaches to diplomacy, their actions in pursuit of American geopolitical goals fit in the broader trend of imperialism. But what is the legacy of American imperialism? And what does its origin story tell us about our current quandaries? For one, elements of big stick, dollar, and moral diplomacy are still widely used today. Channeling the memory of Teddy Roosevelt, the United States routinely conducts military exercises with the Republic of South Korea. And these efforts are designed specifically to send a message to America's North Korean adversaries about the power of the United States Armed Forces. Ever since 2011, the United States has imposed economic sanctions on Iran in order to prevent that nation from becoming a nuclear power. And in 2019, the United States refused to recognize Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who used his power to undermine free and fair elections in 2018. Furthermore, much of the rhetoric that is used today to justify foreign intervention in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere echoes the arguments of early imperialists. In a 2003 speech about American involvement in the Middle East, President George W. Bush remarked,
"The advance of freedom is the calling of our time. It is the calling of our country."
And beyond the rhetoric, Bush's invasion of Iraq mirrors the American episode in the Philippines. The Iraqi people celebrated the overthrow of their dictator, as the Filipinos had done when the Spanish were expelled. But the American occupation of Iraq soon lost favor among the locals and led to a long insurgent conflict, one that damaged America's reputation and divided its people. The argument that the United States is uniquely able and uniquely obligated to free people of the world from tyrannical forms of government appeals to Americans' sense of exceptionalism. And to be sure, the world is a better place in the absence of brutal dictators. However, if the imperialism of the early 20th century can teach us anything, it's that we must also be cognizant of the underlying economic, social, and political motivations at play, so that we do not corrupt American values under the pretense of upholding them. Next time, we'll keep with international affairs and look at American involvement in the First World War. See you then.